All right, welcome back. Our next national security spotlight looks at this from the U.S. perspective, and we are thrilled to have John Carlin with us today. John recently served as the Principal Associate Deputy Attorney General of the United States. He also previously served as the DOJ's Assistant Attorney General for National Security. As the AAG, he oversaw nearly 400 employees responsible for protecting the country against international and domestic terrorism, espionage, cyber, and other national security threats. Before that, he was chief of staff and senior counsel to the director of the FBI, where he helped lead the FBI's response to cyber threats. On top of all that, John's the author of the book, Dawn of the Code War, America's Battle Against Russia, China, and the Rising Global Cyber Threat, which I believe I see on David's desk right now.
Indeed.
John joins us from DC. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Bruce. It's great to be back at this forum.
Thank you. And our moderator is Dave Lashway. To moderate this important Q&A, we're always pleased to have one of the leading lawyers for crisis management, cybersecurity, and data security incidents. David is a partner at Sidley. He co-leads the global privacy and cybersecurity practice. He has advised private and public organizations on incidents across almost every critical infrastructure sector. He also has deep experience in election security and misinformation-related issues, and routinely leads responses to ransomware-related matters. David resides in the DC office of his firm. Welcome, David.
Thanks so much, Bruce. Thanks for having me back, and we're delighted to have John here today. We've had a great series of sessions today, really good turnout, participation, addressing a number of the complex issues associated with both incidents and incident response matters. As Bruce mentioned, we're now going to pull the lens back and take just about 30 minutes or a little bit less to have a conversation with John about national security related issues associated with these types of matters. Those of us who are participating today through a variety of the different conversations that have occurred, whether it was the GDPR regulatory discussions, issues associated with the complexity of cross-border related matters, the most recent panel that just discussed issues associated with supply chain and the types of supply chain incidents that we've experienced both in Europe as well as in the United States and in the Middle East and elsewhere. Obviously, national security and national security policy is really a key pillar in the context of these types of matters. We've seen recently also with the insurance panel discussion earlier today and Lloyd's recent action around taking issue with nation-state related incidents and whether or not coverage would be available in those circumstances, and some creative new thinking that's occurring in the financial markets to address those types of matters. During this forum in the past, we've talked many times over the years, both in the US forum as well as the European forum, this forum, about the coming conflict in cybersecurity. John, obviously, as Bruce mentioned, has written an excellent book, The Dawn of the Cold War, the book sitting in front of me. And in the book, I know many folks on this forum have reviewed it. He highlights a number of issues from petty crime all the way through to terrorist and arguably cyber war related matters. We've been waiting, and there have been a lot of conversations around cyber war and national security overlays, as well as the complexity of designating matters, cyber crime versus cyber war. Clearly, those of us who were directly involved in the NotPetya events from 2017 experienced firsthand some of the complexities associated with the differences between run-of-the-mill cyber crime, ransomware, and operational interference related attacks, and what might constitute a future cyber war. John's book highlights those issues, that commentary. Well, a significant amount of time has passed since 2018, since he wrote the book. A lot of John's observations still hold today. Just 8 days ago, we had the leadership team from the Ukrainian cyber defense here in our offices in Washington. We participated in a number of meetings with U.S. government officials, John's recent former colleagues, as well as others from around the world to talk about the continuing efforts in Ukraine to defend against what they are viewing as three categories of events. One, cyber crime, which is on the rise in Ukraine and in Ukraine's periphery. Two, cyber war. Obviously, you've heard from the cyber authorities in Ukraine that they are experiencing cyber war activities and incidents that they would attribute to and categorize as cyber war. And third, a new category that frankly we had not spent much time discussing or focusing on, and that is cyber war crimes. How to investigate them, how to document them, how to even define them. The complex area that all the folks participating today work in is only becoming ever more complex. And with that backdrop, we're very fortunate, as Bruce mentioned, to have John today for 30 minutes to talk us through his observations on the key pillars of U.S. national security policy associated with these types of issues, where it is today, and I think most importantly, where it may be going. And then I know John will talk a little bit about toward the end for a few minutes about what we're also seeing with our counterparties and partners around the world, our key partners in Europe and elsewhere. So over to you, John.
Thanks, David. It's great to be back with you, and it's great to be back at this forum. I thought where to start is when I last talked to this group, we were getting started in the new administration, and I returned to government service after assisting private sector companies responding to these threats on day one. And the events that hit this administration early helped focus the mind, and I think allow this administration to hit the ground running when it came to focusing on cybersecurity. Simply, cybersecurity now is national security. And while that was a more controversial concept when we first adjusted our approach towards cybersecurity, starting with a case where we indicted members of the People's Liberation Army in China for activities that, although they were done wearing uniform, were criminal in nature, but affected ultimately the national security, not just of the United States, but really of countries that share values throughout the world. While that was once controversial, I think a series of events early on in this administration have made that now a relatively accepted idea. And when I talk about those events, let me run through them for a second. So one, you come in on January 20th, we're facing the challenge of still responding to a pandemic. In the United States, we're facing the challenges posed by the storming of the Capitol on January 6th, and we're confronting solar winds. So a supply chain compromise that affected and allowed Russian intelligence services to target not just private companies throughout the world, but also the US government, including the Justice Department. Shortly on its heels, you had significant intrusions into Microsoft Exchange. You had the attack on Colonial pipeline that I think in a way, maybe even more so than one of the first instances responded to, which was the North Korean attacks on Sony Pictures I talked about in the book. It's one thing, movies are certainly both as American as you can get, and also affect the world and gets an incredible amount of media attention when you hit something that affects Hollywood. But long lines at the pump, I think, hits even more home for the average American, the average citizen around the world, as we're seeing as we're facing an oncoming energy crisis due to Russian aggression. So the Colonial pipeline hack, and the fact that that hack occurred in a protected ecosystem where they knew they were safe or thought they were safe from enforcement because many of them were located in Russia or in countries that were aligned with Russia. And you went from the Colonial pipeline, and then it wasn't bad enough that you were hitting gasoline, particularly in the U.S. They went after the burgers that people would enjoy here around July 4th with another attack on JBS, a global multinational company. These are both for-profit ransomware extortion type attacks by aligned criminal groups. And then finally, Kaseya, an attack that affected a company that provided services to hundreds of other companies. So one ransomware extortion attack could affect a whole number of companies that were relying on Kaseya. So that environment or universe of attacks, both I think laid bare what we'd seen throughout COVID, and I think is still, talk to FBI, if you talk to cyber groups evaluating the threat, true, which is that the threats and incidents continue to grow. But having that many that close in time focused the mind here and required a fundamental strategic shift. So one, and I'll focus a little bit on what the Justice Department was doing, working with allies throughout the world, is we can't just respond post-event and try to go after and put handcuffs on the particular individuals involved. That needs to be part of a response strategy, but it can't be exclusive. And in order for that to even that part to work, requires close and immediate cooperation with the private sector. And you think, and let me take a step back for a second, of the fundamental strategic shift that is occurring in cyber in the United States and with many allies across the world when we're facing the terrorism threat post-September 11th. We invested billions of dollars, created new agencies and departments, Director of National Intelligence, the division that I headed, the National Security Division, first in the litigating division at Justice in 50 years, the Department of Homeland Security, all around the premise that we had failed to effectively share information within government and between governments prior to September 11th, that we could not do that again, that it caused the innocent loss of life of thousands of American civilians, and that successfully prosecuting after the fact was not success. Success was preventing that type of attack from occurring by effectively sharing information. The challenge that we face now is, I think, exponentially more complex, which is it's not just sharing information between and among governments, it's sharing information across the government and private sector divide at the speed and scale of cyber threats. So the more focused strategic shift that you're seeing here as you try to get that information and then use it is, we can't just use it for prosecutions. We need to go after the whole ecosystem that's providing the profit incentives for these bad guys to commit their acts. What does that mean? That means actually going after the money when it is part of the ecosystem that they get in ransomware payments. And so you've seen first of its kind seizures of the currency that's being held in digital wallets. Go after the digital wallets, seize it, try to return it to the victim. If you can't return it to the victim, at least deprive the bad guy of the benefit of their act by preventing them from accessing their ill-gotten gains. So that's one. Number two, don't just go after the human beings involved. They're creating essentially cyber weapons of mass destruction. So whether it's Emonet or other botnets that are set up that can be exploited by multiple users, or going after the web shells that are left in people's computers using a new legal authorities in the U.S., where we're not going after necessarily solely for evidence of a crime. We're going after it to clean up after an intrusion so that the next bad guy can't take advantage of the malware that's already been set up. So that's number two, and that requires working with the private sector along with across national boundaries. Third, go after the money launderers, those who are taking the digital currency and seeking to exchange it into cash. Digital currency ain't worth much if you can't get it out of your account. That requires a different set of criminals. Let's go after them using all of the tools that we have. We created a new task force at the Justice Department, working closely with Treasury Department, working closely with foreign allies to use sanctions and other tools to make that transfer more difficult, to go chase the money as it tries to move from wallet to wallet, particularly true with North Korea. Also using international partners. It doesn't matter if they show up in a US courtroom. Let's go after not just the people that did a particular hack, but the malware coders that they're depending on, because they increasingly look like a business. And many of you sophisticated in this audience think of ransomware, the phrase ransomware as a service, which means essentially that they've created their own supply chain, if you will, of those who create the code, those who run efficient marketplaces to sell the products or exploits as they occur, those who actually use those tools for criminal gain, those that then help them launder the money. So as we analyze the sophisticated market they've set up, go attack it at every single phase across the market.
And John,
Yeah.
with respect to a number of the tools that you've identified, I think one of the things that you've said, I think is really important, is that these tools, to implement them effectively, require shared values, both public and private sector values, but also cross-border values. A lot of the participants today obviously are spread not only here in the United States, but in Europe and around the world. Creating that shared value system, let alone to be able to do that at the speed that you're articulating, is a significant challenge. One of our participants today, for example, publicly, and I think some of us have off-quoted him from his public statements. He represented a social media company, and they met with the Vatican after the Christchurch shootings. And our participant today had a quote or a line that was quoted in the media where he said, "Yes, we not only have to be moral in our actions to respond to these events, but we have to have speed." In order to deal with the fact that they were seeing just multiple sites popping up with the videos attendant to those actions in New Zealand. You'll recall, John, and you worked on that. How do we create collectively across this group, and then obviously between the larger groups within the public and private sector, these common theories and common shared values, so that we can implement the types of tools that you're talking about? What efforts has the U.S. government, for example, taken to do that?
It's a great question. I think you're seeing being driven by the White House on down, getting the like-minded professionals, like the folks in this group, like governments that have the responsibility of ransomware together. I actually think some of the norms in this space are more developed than they were. Maybe countries do not find it acceptable to attack critical infrastructure, healthcare facilities, oil facilities, in order to extort them for money. And so then the question is that an actual tool of a foreign government so that you can go after the government? And this is the blended threat that I think we've long seen in this space. So is it the government itself? So is it someone wearing the uniform of their military? Is it someone in their intelligence service? Is it one step removed by that government direction, where they're taking a group that might exist to do other types of criminal activity and exploiting that group for a particular national security aim? And then thirdly, is it a criminal group? And this is where it becomes a nation state or an acceptable actor. Is it a criminal group and it's not acting at government direction, but it has essentially safe harbor, and the place where they are physically located is refusing to take any action to disrupt either the tools that they're using or go after the individuals? If you look at, I'll talk about the big four bad actors when it comes to nation states, all of whom act a little bit differently, and maybe answer your question in part by updating where we are from when we last talked. Look at North Korea, who's essentially the world's largest bank robber. They're a rogue nation in so many respects that the world is really united in terms of trying to deprive them from currency for the regime that can be used to commit atrocities. And that's done through legal mechanisms like sanctions. In order to evade those sanctions and get currency, North Korea is routinely committing what just look like normal criminal acts to steal, straight up steal money through business email compromise schemes and others, and through extortion schemes. Most recently, I think many in this group are familiar with Maui ransomware and their success in exploiting that ransomware, in particular against healthcare sectors. So in response, what you're seeing, I think, is like-minded countries not just going after the criminals involved in exposing the way that they are using those tools, but also, and this is where you'll continue to see movement, David, which is going after the digital currency exchanges that are being used to try to get that digital currency from the victim of the hack into the coffers of the North Korean government. And at some point, again, there's a weak point on the chain where they have to get it from digital currency into hard currency. So that's on North Korea. Iranian actors, I think you just saw a significant event now or update. You had a group that was exploiting Log4j. And otherwise, many of you, I think, have had clients who've been fallen victim to this group. They often did it for pure criminal purposes. But you saw that, and if you haven't seen it, encourage you to look at a joint advisory put out by Department of Homeland Security and Department of Justice on the specific tactics, techniques, and procedures that they're using. But also by revealing that group and showing its connection to the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, you saw Albania take unprecedented action where they said, enough is enough. We're ceasing, and this has not occurred before in cyber, we're cutting all diplomatic relations with Iran solely because of their cyber attacks against our sovereignty. And that is another, I think, developing norm, David, where we need to see multiple like-minded nations say, that's a line that you cannot cross. It's the not petcha line in a way. China, I think, is more of a steady state of activity where a lot of what they're focusing is on economic espionage, but there are criminal groups there. And I think the key message to China, again, is when we see criminal activity, that countries who are doing business with you and partners are saying that that's not acceptable. You need to take action against those actors in your border. And finally, and deliberately last, but Russia, which I think it presents now a unprecedented threat in terms of their aggression against Europe. In cyber, at least, it's clarified the mind. And whereas before, I think that some countries didn't want to, were reluctant to openly confront or call out the behavior in Russia, it's become clear how that attempting repeatedly to essentially try to change behavior without directly confronting it or calling it out has failed. And so you're seeing countries now respond directly, and I think you'll continue to see US action working with multinational partners against Russian aggression in Ukraine, including its cyber aggression. And you've seen success on that front. I think everyone's surprised that the attacks, the cyber attacks anyway, have not been more effective in Ukraine. And that's partly because like-minded nations around the world have gotten together. The other kind of interesting side is when you looked at some of these organized criminal groups emanating out of Russia, they often had members in other parts of Eastern Europe and around the world. And those groups have fractured at times because they're on the wrong side of a Russian missile attack in Ukraine. They no longer want to work cooperatively with the Russian criminal who's supporting the regime. And so some of that lockstep criminal group is come under pressure.
Let's take 1 minute, John. I think we've got a couple minutes left, and I just want to ask you one final question to maybe wrap up, which is, I think the frame you're setting for us and putting some of these event by event related tools and discussions that we've had throughout the day and previously in this context. In a recent seminar, the former head of MI6, when asked the question of what is at stake in light of these types of developments, he paused for a moment and then said, I think, as you know, nothing short of the future of the Enlightenment. Going back to that shared values construct that you set out for us today so helpfully. I think we're seeing the erosion, as we heard with the insurance team, and the complexity associated with business interruption and dealing with the impacts of these types of events in the normal course, and how risk can be shared and dealt with appropriately, either under law, by regulatory development, prescriptive or performance-based, or through economic tools like insurance. But with developments like Lloyd's recently and the erosion of the normative standards with the GGE process breaking down, the global norms really being called into question, I think your observation is exactly right. We're seeing different norms getting developed in these as-applied circumstances. Is that how you see the near and short long term for us in this space? Should we continue to, should this group of 800 or 900 of us joined here, continue to expect non-homogenized legal regimes, norm developments in as-applied settings, increased conflict, these types of things that you're laying out for us today?
Unfortunately, yes. I think that said it well, but we are in an existential struggle with regimes that fundamentally don't share our value and don't want our way of life to succeed. And so that battle is being fought, and this is unprecedented, with companies on the front lines. And they are seeing that, whether it's trying to comply with new sanctions regimes or, in this case, defend themselves as victims of cyber-related attacks. Fundamentally, if we end up so government and working together with the private sector in order to go after and make it as difficult as possible for those two attacks to occur is vital, not just for the company, but for the societies in which we live. That's point one. Point two, though, is it is still the case that a dedicated adversary, even using relatively simple techniques like social engineering, can get into a system. So for all of our clients, they are not safe. And that's true of government and private sector, which means switching to a resilience mindset and really playing out, okay, let's assume, I don't even care how, let's assume that they get in and do damage. What is the damage that they would do and how would I get back to doing business? And I think as you look towards US policy, working with foreign partners, you're going to see the cyber strategy of the United States focus heavily on resilience and what can we do, particularly in areas of critical infrastructure, to ensure that even when a successful attack occurs, that it does not cause the fall of the country or the company where that attack occurs.
Yeah, John, you mentioned the U.S. national security policy relating to cyber. We know that the White House is currently, the team over at the White House is drafting that policy as we speak today. Is that what we should expect from that, to include a resiliency and durability framework and the various pillars underneath that?
Yes, I think that's what we should expect. And I think, and this is not a practice point you can take home, I think they're really going to focus on the human beings as well, roles and responsibilities and governance when it comes to this space. What we're seeing right now in the US, for instance, in terms of trends of types of attacks, are attacks that are based on social engineering. So we're not seeing the most sophisticated tools being deployed. And that is because they don't need to deploy the tools in order to have the success that they're having. And so I think we're going to have a strategy to really focus on the blocking and tackling necessary to be resilient and to ensure that you're making life more difficult for the adversary.
John, thanks so much for your time today. It was really terrific, and thank you for your observations and bringing us forward from back when you wrote the book. I think it's been a great contribution to the discussion. So thank you for spending some time with us.
Thank you, Nathan.
Thank you, John. And thank you, David, for a great job moderating that panel. Really appreciate both of you and for spending time with us today.